in many ways, they're seen as just kind of looking at how to look after themselves to maintain their grip on power. And these kinds of tools, they're borrowing from the Kremlin playbook because it's effective at quelling dissent. So you could argue that they're not exactly pro-Russian. They're just behaving in a way that will, in an authoritarian way, that will enable them to hold. Sure. Well, last night was actually the second night of mass street protests that we've been seeing here in Tbilisi. And before that, even people were coming out in crowds to protest against this legislation that the government's been trying to push through. And again, last night we had police in riot gear using water cannon and tear gas and pepper spray to dispel, to get rid of the protesters who were out, to force them to clear the area around Parliament. But there were huge numbers of people, very determined, and it went on sort of cat and mouse really through most of the night. I think by this morning, a lot of the barricades and things that people had started using, like benches and things, to kind of block the roads and to put up barriers between themselves and the police, had been cleared away. And there was a bit of a cleanup operation going on with shop windows being cleaned down from graffiti and so forth. And then a bit of a quiet moment before actually the good news was announced, which was that the government has said, okay, we're going to withdraw this bill, given the amount of controversy it's generated, and we
And
don't want people to get injured and hurt. We're going to withdraw this bill. So a victory of sorts for all of those tens of thousands of people who come out to say, no, we don't want this.
yeah, and traction with the government, which is a rare pleasure indeed. Can you very briefly sum up what the bill was? Because I want to move on to what else is
Yeah,
sort of happening, the sort of background to this in Georgia. But
yeah,
just
sure.
very briefly, the bill.
So actually two pieces of legislation, and one of them has been dubbed like a Russian law because it's very, very similar to what Vladimir Putin introduced, or what the Russian government introduced back in 2012, which basically it requires anyone who receives more than 20% of their funding, if you're a civil society organization or you're a media organization, if you get more than 20% of your funding from abroad, you have to register yourself as a foreign agent. And this was seen as basically a way of muzzling dissent, and stigmatizing anyone who was basically receiving foreign money, and has been very good at silencing the Kremlin's critics. And the
Mm.
idea that it was going to be repeated here just drove people nuts, really.
And that's the point, because you mentioned the Kremlin there. All of this has everything to do, doesn't it, with the sort of prospect of the Russification of Georgia, which seems to be ongoing at the same time as this sort of conflicting aspiration to join the EU. So what's the state of Georgia at the moment? It sounds pretty perilous.
Well, what's going on is it's really sometimes really hard to kind of like pick apart all of the conflicting sort of elements to this. But I mean, on the one hand, you've got the opposition saying, look, this government is pro-Russian, and they were saying no to this Russian law, and you're all Russian slaves, and everything that you do seems to smack of this kind of like obsession with going down the path, taking Georgia away from its European aspirations to join the EU. Georgia's actually submitted its application to join the European Union, and that it's therefore they're in sort of they're working with the Kremlin. They haven't introduced the sanctions that the European Union and the US has placed on Russia, and they don't speak out loudly enough in their support of Ukraine. In fact, there's been a public falling out between the Georgian government and the Ukrainian government, and that's a very powerful sort of idea. But on the other hand, a kind of more complex look at this is that actually the Georgian government is still kind of on the outwards appearance pro-European. It's got a sort of a liberal agenda that says that we are going to still take Georgia to Europe, but in many ways they're seen as just kind of looking at how to look after themselves to maintain their grip on power, and these kinds of tools they're borrowing from the Kremlin playbook because it's effective at quelling dissent. So you could argue that they're not exactly pro-Russian. They're just behaving in a way that will, in an authoritarian way that will enable them to hold on to power. And they've
Mm.
got elections next year, and they think that this is what they need to do, because the biggest, let's say, critics of the government here, or the most effective ones, are these organizations, a few handful of them really, that are shining a light on the sort of bad things that the government are up to. So they're holding the government accountable. So the government is constantly complaining about these organizations that have money from the West, and they're saying, look, this isn't your function. You shouldn't be receiving money
Mm.
to be politically active. But just one thing I wanted to mention is that all of that money, a lot of Western money from the EU, from the US coming into Georgia, the biggest benefactor, the biggest recipient is actually the Georgian state itself. So it sort of smacks of hypocrisy to say, well, you can't give your money to these organizations that are negative about us, but at the same time, we're very happy to receive all this financing to keep our economy and to keep our state, going to fill up our budget.
Yeah, and just very briefly, Robin, what about public reaction? Who's public opinion supporting? Are they, I don't know, because there's something about the whole situation that sort of is vaguely seems vaguely reminiscent of the volatile situation, in Ukraine in 2014, that Maidan
Yeah, it is.
revolution.
Yeah, it's reminiscent of that exactly, because all polls consistently put more than 80%, or around 80% of the population say they want Georgia to be in Europe, and in fact that they want Georgia to join NATO. So there is this big support for Georgia's European integration. They very powerful, moving words from some of the people we spoke to, as women last night, said, we belong to Europe, we are Europe. My ancestors, she said, they made a choice, and that choice shouldn't be questioned, because for many years, Georgia, before the Soviet Union, Georgia was a very refreshing kind of sort of liberal, fledgling democracy that was emerging, and they always consider themselves European. And so we do see this kind of like, it was as if enough was enough, and we had the sort of heartening scenes of these thousands of people coming out, young and old, but they see this for what it is. That this is, the government can say, oh well, we're doing this for transparency. We want that,
Mm.
we want people to, we want to know where our money's coming from, or where this money is coming from. But it's transparent to everybody that this is not a democratic law to be
Yeah.
introducing,
Mm.
and it's taking Georgia in the wrong direction.